It's my pleasure to welcome to the show two friends of mine, Joe Vital and Rachel Thunder. I'll just start by asking you to introduce yourselves. We'll start with Joe and then Rachel.
Definitely. Thanks, Nick. Thanks for having us here. Joseph Vital, uh, Bonjour, Anin, Wajin Wiju Adijana Ka, hello, all my relatives. I'm South Mountain. I'm an enrolled member of the Red Lake Nation and also a proud Mexican.
Danse, Granaskamoten, Anaskamoten, Upsis Nanahiowak, Upsis Rachel Thunder. Hello, and thank you for having us on, Nick, and thank you to everybody who's watching or listening. My name is Rachel Thunder. I'm Plains Cree Nihio Nihiowak Treaty 8.
Well, I just want to thank you both for joining us. This is a really kind of sensitive issue. We're talking about the Red Roof Depot and the demolition that is slotted or scheduled to take place next week. And the history of Minneapolis is quite interesting. And in fact, there's been several studies around, the kind of legal history and the political history of the land and who actually and how did the United States actually acquire this land. And I was doing a little bit of research. The actual first, kind of settlers that came here created, U.S. settlers, I should say, created a military fort, Fort Snelling. And this, what became the city of Minneapolis, was actually a military reservation that was kind of coercively taken from Dakota people. So this is originally Dakota homelands. And so the very origins of the city itself begins through an act of dispossession, invasion, and settlement. And now we're talking about in the context, in the recent history of, train derailments and the spilling of, vinyl chloride or chlorine, which is a very toxic substance in East Palestine, Ohio, causing untold damage to a neighborhood. Toxic fumes spilling, killing pets, making people sick. The effects of which we probably won't really fully understand until generations later. But right here in Minneapolis, we have something called the arsenic triangle. And one of the kind of key features, in this arsenic triangle is this site, this Red Roof Depot site that is scheduled to be demolished. It might be a little bit hard for outsiders to really understand the stakes of this particular struggle. So I'm going to ask Joe to maybe just give us a brief history of what your organization is and what it's been doing to stop the destruction of this toxic truck depot.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. And the fight is incredibly nuanced. It starts back in the 1950s, where there was a pesticide plant that was constructed off of Hiawatha, where a main ingredient in that pesticide was arsenic, and it was transported via rail, and the arsenic would just fly out into the neighborhood. Later on in the 60s, the roof depot was constructed, and underneath it, which is kind of the reason why we're here today, is portions of that arsenic was encapsulated underneath during construction. And we know this because there are testing wells around East Phillips that monitors the movement of that arsenic, because it is now seeped into the groundwater and is slowly moving towards the southwest. And the arsenic triangle was first coined in the early 2000s, but the Department of Agriculture understood or knew of this back in the 1990s, but they didn't have the capabilities to remediate or remove this arsenic. And so they had to wait until the feds in the early 2000s got involved, and over 500 homes had their soil removed, mine included, where folks in hazmat suits went into our backyards and dug out our soil to replace it with different soil. And this is incredibly, it's horrible in the sense where I remember as a young Spanish speaker, fortunately my mother, who is a Red Laker, speaks English, where we could translate the government letter of, this is why we're coming into your soil, to remove it. My neighborhood was predominantly Mexican, Spanish speaking first, and a lot of folks didn't understand that you shouldn't be growing fruits and vegetables in their backyards, which they had been doing for generations, because that's simply what we did. And fast forwarding it, back to 2015, uh, the neighborhood of East Phillips had this plan to purchase the Roof Depot site, to kind of remediate a lot of these long-standing impacts that I've just discussed with environmental impacts, where folks can't even grow food in their backyard. So where are they going to grow fresh fruit, get fresh vegetables, because the area is a food desert? Little Earth is just right there, and the only thing resembling kind of like a convenience store is just a corner store with like a small section of like highly expensive food. So the idea was to acquire Roof Depot, which is, a site that is 7.5 acres large, 280 square feet is the building. And it would be retrofitted to include several components, one including an indoor urban farm, the other being classroom space, a training center incubator for, the green economy. So learning how to, maintain and repair solar panels, EV vehicles and such. All of this retrofitted with a solar array that would probably be the biggest in the state, at least citywide, because, again, we're dealing with 7 acres of land that would be, and all of it being powered by solar.
And can you talk a little bit about the historic significance of this particular neighborhood? You have communities like Little Earth, but also, you described a little bit of the kind of residents who live there now in East Phillips, but who lives here, and why is it this site that is so heavily polluted?
It's all in the racist urban planning, and I appreciate you so much for first talking on the origins, displacement and, genocide. It's no different today than it was back then, in the sense where East Phillips was strategically created by the city of Minneapolis to inhabit its undesirables. We're all very familiar with redlining. East Phillips was actually yellow lined, which is, a tier up, which means that, mostly folks weren't able to get insurance on their homes, and only certain mortgages were allowed in the area. So not as horrible as redlining, but it's the tier up. And I talk about it's always been a place for undesirables because the city planning commission detailed that it needed to be a place to put all of its immigrants. So back then it was, the Irish, Jewish folks, and that hasn't changed much, because although the immigration status of folks have changed, where it's no longer though like Eastern Europeans, but it is now our Latinx relatives from the South, or our Ethiopian relatives or Somali relatives coming in. And so, the area is mostly indigenous, given that Little Earth is there. It's the largest urban indigenous population in Minnesota. East African, Latinx, Mexican, Ecuadorian, some Filipino is what we see, and white. And I'll just add more to that, because, what we're dealing with here is a environmental injustice, but it's a racial environmental injustice issue, in that, we know it's highly diverse, but the average income of the area is about $33,000 for a household. And it drops significantly to Little Earth to $10,000 annually. So deeply poor, deeply diverse area. And it was all constructed to put not only the undesirables, but the industry of the city. And we see that, with Smith Foundry, Bituminous Roadways, which is an asphalt plant and a metallurgy area industry that is right next to Roof Depot. And then the city's current waterworks facility exists there, which is a truck stop where, the city heavy duty vehicles come in to fuel up and to leave via Hiawatha or Cedar Avenue, which cut right through East Phillips. And that's its whole other discussion, where highways and strategically placed next to low-income communities of color. But just want to paint this out for the audience that what we're East Phillips is huddled in between, a highway right next to industry, and the city wants to construct a bigger truck facility for all of its fleet to come in to fuel, then leave. increasing the truck traffic by 115%, according to its own environmental assessment worksheet.
Yeah, thanks for that overview. And it just seems, this kind of environmental racism. We often think of really catastrophic events like the train derailment in East Palestine, or the ruptures in a pipeline that spill oil all over the place. But this kind of environmental racism is something that takes place over time. It's a slow kind of violence. I think Rob Nixon is a scholar who says something along those lines. And it's specifically targeting, it's very racialized, and it's grounded, especially in a place like Minneapolis, in a history of settler colonialism and indigenous dispossession. And I think a lot of people want to sort of silo out indigenous issues as something that exists on the reservation, that this is an issue. There's water protectors, they're out on the land, not in the city, out on the land, in a rural environment, stopping a pipeline, right? But this is a very kind of a very kind of historic movement, in the sense that this isn't the first time that this has happened, right? And not even just to an indigenous community. The building of these highways have displaced Black communities and poor communities. And I want to turn to Rachel, who some of you may not know, but I know this. I'm going to call her out. Rachel's actually a scientist. She led a really beautiful and powerful prayer march to free our elder Leonard Peltier last year. But she's also a scientist. She has a degree. She has a master's degree. So I want to ask you, Rachel, what are some of the kind of environmental consequences because of this generational pollution that has accrued over time and concentrated in this specific area?
Right. Thank you, Nick. And Joe, feel free to step in, because Joe, I would consider Joe a scientist as well. So, um, yeah, with the long-term exposure and release of these toxins and these poisons on this very concentrated site, um, it's not like they have dissipated over time. And with the scheduled demolition of Roof Depot on the 27th of this month, which is February 2023, for anybody that's watching in the future, the fear and the reality is that when demolition occurs, all of those toxins that are stored and poisons that are stored in the soil, in the water at that site, will be disturbed and effectively re-released on a more broad scale level in the East Phillips neighborhood, which, that will continue to contaminate soil in the area. I know Joe had mentioned that there had been some soil remediation that had happened in the past. You would be looking at having to redo that again more extensively. We're looking at water contamination with the arsenic and other toxins and poisons that are there. The community gardens, all of this residue from this demolition would effectively be released and spread, distributed more widely here in South Minneapolis. Little Earth, the United Tribes of Little Earth, is only a couple of blocks away from the site. And Joe went over some of the other communities that are here in South Minneapolis. But, that kind of remediation for those sites, it takes a lot of work. And the earth is resilient, right? The earth does not need us. We need the earth. The earth would heal itself over time given millions of years. But there are avenues to remediate in an environmentally friendly way versus demolition and spreading these toxins more broadly. And something that comes to mind is bioremediation. So using specific plants or trees to that have that capability of kind of siphoning out these poisons and toxins through a natural system. And I want Joe to talk a little bit about this here in a little bit, but kind of the plans given the community co-op and development that's being proposed, instead of demolition, all of these environmental friendly and earth friendly tactics to create not just a positive space for the community, but a positive footprint on the earth.
Yeah, and can you talk about that, Joe? The East Phillips Neighborhood Institute. It's not just, kind of a negation of this project to say we don't want this. It's to say that we actually have plans to build something that's better and that will be sustainable and will actually help heal the land and the community and the people who live there as well. Can you talk about that project with the what is called EPNI, or the East Phillips Neighborhood Institute?
Certainly. Yeah, I got involved with EPNI, about 2 years ago, and have been a volunteer organizer with them ever since. And, Rachel's absolutely right in that when we got word of the city's plans to demolish and to, expand its waterworks yard to, consolidate its entire truck fleet into this area that we have recognized as somewhere that, needs better air quality. You could talk about, land, and in the sense, it's the air that we're really discussing right now because, that truck concentration, East Phillips has the highest rates of asthma. It kind of flips between the north and the south side, with those numbers annually. And it all depends on how it's being tracked. However, with adding to that, and again, this fight is so nuanced. There's so much I want to say on it. Both of those areas are a north and south side green zone, which is a value from the city. Like, it's not actual law by the city, but the north and south side green zones are councils that make up the communities that live there. And they make recommendations to the city for renewable energy infrastructure projects. The north and south side green zones, at least through value, and the city recognizing them, means that air quality needs to improve in these areas. And there needs to be, affordable housing constructed in these areas. And in fact, this project goes back on all of those things the city claims to care about because, as I said before, East Phillips is a very poor and diverse area, but the city of Minneapolis is getting more and more expensive. And so, you're bringing in this truck fleet that will worsen air quality because in Hennepin County, the biggest pollution is cars, vehicle emission. And I think that's relatively the same anywhere you go. East Phillips, there's other industries that we've talked about before. And so to kind of reverse a lot of these generational harms that I've just discussed and the currents that exist, EPNI, along with the community, created this, cooperative, multi-use, plex to mitigate the harm that, is not only in the air, the land, but also economical, kind of going against, capitalism in a sense where it's no longer, a fight to the top, but really circular economy. The indoor urban farm would be run by aquaponics, meaning, fish poop would fertilize the plants that would grow vertically inside. And if we're growing vertically inside in a cold state like Minnesota, that means we can grow year long. That also means we can keep people hired year long, where they don't have to go, west for jobs or anywhere else. They can stay here, and we would employ those here. We'd give second chances to folks that come back to our community. And I did say, it'd be cooperatively owned by the community. Shares would be owned by the community, with landlords only getting one share. We do want to recognize, the issues with greenwashing. And, the plan is still in the works. But when we did a financial analysis, with all the components, including the cultural market, rents, the profit from, selling the solar back to Xcel Energy, which there is a grid across the street from the site. So it just makes sense to construct solar and there wouldn't be a loss of electricity when you send it across, we'd make upwards to $11 million a year in profit using 1% of the electricity to run the facility annually. And this was always to say, I know, Nick, you mentioned this is a plan for an alternative, but that is the emphasis of like literally anything could go in this site besides a fucking truck stop, besides, unearthing arsenic first and exposing that to community. There has always been a better plan. EPNI, the steering committee, has always fought for, the plan for an indoor urban farm. But we'd be just as fine as this place just being left as it is and being constructed as a park, something that is, again, for public use, for public benefit. But we do have this amazing plan that is not only profitable, but would help mitigate a lot of the harm that has been occurring, generationally. And, Rachel touched on it so well, the environmental impacts that we would see and the loss of the economic and social mobility that we could see with anything else to happen with this site. It's a once in a lifetime opportunity, and we feel it's deliberately being sabotaged by the city simply because the resources wouldn't be dependent on the state. The resources wouldn't be dependent on the city. The community would own this, run this, and be autonomous. And I think that freaks the hell out of people.
Mm-hmm. Nick, could I jump in really quick? I just wanted to add a couple of things. Because when I was listening to Joe speak, it reminded me, there was a few thoughts that came to my mind. Here I'm a new resident here of East Phillips here in South Minneapolis. And I go to community events, like I go to beading classes, I go to sewing classes. I'll go in there, and there are community members here in Little Earth in South Minneapolis that I'll hear weekly say, "Oh, I'm having problems breathing today," or "My asthma is really acting up today," or my 3-year-old, I had to use a nebulizer on this morning. I wake up in the morning, I look at my phone, and I have notifications from my weather app that says, poor air quality. I've lived all over Turtle Island, and this is the only place that I've woken up to those kind of notifications. I've lived in LA. I never woke up to those kind of notifications. It's here in South Minneapolis. And East Phillips has some of the highest rates of asthma, lead poisoning, and heart disease already in the state of Minnesota. There's a lot of other health issues. There's a lot of rare cardiovascular diseases, a lot of personal stories from sick community members and family members that if you go out here and you spend time in these communities, you'll hear. And like Joe was saying, it's hard to put a finger on it because this has been going on for so long, right? That it's hard to say, oh, this specific thing is what's causing all of this. It's not one specific thing. It's all of these years of and generations of environmental injustice and deliberate placement of these kind of toxins in an already disproportionately abused community and people. So something else I wanted to mention that, the city had another site for this truck depot that they were looking at in East Hennepin here in Minneapolis. But ultimately what it comes down to is money, because the city of Minneapolis wants to sell that site and that land to developers, right? So it all comes back to money, this illusion of power through money that these systems, that the government and these systems and these institutions have used to oppress our people since the beginning of colonization. And I always think of John Trudell when I think of money and this illusion of power, because there's no true power in money. That's an illusion that the settlers and the colonizers created to control people and society. The only real power is with the earth. And as indigenous people, as the true and original people of Turtle Island and of the so-called Americas, that power is where we get our strength and our power. Like our connection to the earth is what fuels us in our cultures and our ceremonies. And the government has always recognized that and tried to disconnect us from that connection with the earth. And it doesn't matter where you are. You don't have to be on a reservation or out like in the bush, you know. There's still environmental issues that are happening in these urban areas. It doesn't mean that it doesn't need to be addressed because it's just as important.
No, and if I can quick, Nick, just add on to that, as you mentioned earlier that, indigenous issues aren't siloed to reservations. And that goes with the same with ceremony. I think oftentimes, I'm an urban Niji, and I can sometimes feel disconnected because I sometimes get under the illusion that this city is not land. In fact, it very much is. It's just underneath the bullshit. And again, Roof Depot, the remediation that we're trying to go through with the EPA remediating the arsenic is, as caretakers, not as, going straight through it as developers, because keeping Roof Depot up and keeping the arsenic encapsulated is harm reduction, in that we're not exposing folks to that, and simultaneously connecting people back to ceremony. The aquaponics I mentioned earlier would be walleye, which is culturally significant to the Anishinaabe people. And, bringing public spaces, because there would be like 10,000 square feet for, a public auditorium where, folks could practice danza. I've heard that from our Mexica relatives, or, to practice prayer or ceremony. Rachel, you've been to those meeting classes. It is so difficult to like schedule and plan them, just because public space, at least in a city, is at a high premium, and nonprofits or, community organizations are being pushed out just because they cannot compete with these developers. And so I just wanted to, highlight the cultural importance of the community's vision in all of this.
I stand here with my sister, my auntie Nicole, representing that South Minneapolis indigenous community and saying no to the demolition at Roof Depot there in South Minneapolis. We don't want that there. We don't want those poisons released there. We don't want those trucks there. We want to protect our children, our grandchildren, and not this generation, but for all the generations to come. I was not planning on speaking today, and I was sitting there and I was looking at these signs, and I remember yesterday was the birthday of John Trudell. And so I was sitting there and I was thinking of John, one of my role models, and some of the words that he said, sitting here in this institution that was meant to control and suppress our people. I always get a sick feeling when I come to these places. And I remember him saying that the only thing that they care about is power. And to them, power is money. Money is an illusion of power. There is no true power in money. And that's the only thing that they care about with this Roof Depot is money. They don't care about us. They don't care about our communities. The only real power is with the earth. There's no power in their systems. They've only been here for 530 years. There's no power here. And as the indigenous people, we are not going to stop protecting the true power, which is the earth. Because the earth doesn't need us. We need the earth. If every single one of us was wiped off the earth today, it might take her millions of years, but she's resilient. She's the true power, not this system, not this money. And we're not going to stop. No demo!
Yeah, thanks so much for that. And, both of you kind of hit on some points that I want to elaborate a little bit more on. And both of you are involved. You're looking at this not just from the perspective of a bird's eye view, but on the ground, engaged in the community. And, as somebody who is, didn't grow up here, I'm a recent arrival. The thing that I noticed the most is that, you have this thing called Minnesota nice, which is total BS. It's just Minnesota mean. That's all there is. There's Minnesota cold and not the weather. Like, the weather should be cold, but people shouldn't be. But the attitude of the city is really quite interesting in terms of how it treats actual human beings and how it treats the original people from this land. And nothing better symbolizes the attitude of this city than the way it treats people who are forced to live out in the elements, in Minnesota winters, outside, on the sidewalks, in, little kind of patches of public space, right? The city does not clear sidewalks, does not clear ice from the sidewalks, but if there's a human being, a warm body on that sidewalk, they will clear it. That's the mentality and the value of the city. You can be a person with disabilities or just a regular person who can't walk on a sidewalk because the city doesn't clear anything, and they don't really care. But if you're a human being who's just sleeping and carrying out a normal bodily function of just living, that is considered illegal and, anathema to whatever values the city has. And there's also the question of housing. You brought this up earlier about the kind of income disparities. And I think, one aspect of this is that, there's alternatives being proposed on one hand, but there's also a severe housing crisis. And it's a housing crisis that is completely fabricated by a real estate market that is artificially inflated. And what that does is, you don't need red lines and yellow lines to ice people out. All you need is landlords and property owning companies to artificially inflate prices, raise rents, raise, property values so that it just becomes unlivable for people. And especially if you create something like what you all are planning to do with the Institute, this is going to create a permanent status, to a place and to a community that I would say the city has always had an antagonistic relationship to. And I want to ask you both about this kind of political process of trying to speak to the humanity of city councilors and legislators about this particular issue, because I remember reading, and I watched some of the video of this when you were in the city council chambers, and I think I don't remember how many city council people voted in favor of what the proposal you guys were proposing, but then immediately after, the chair of the city council, the president of the city council, who didn't vote in favor of this project that you are proposing, then introduced a motion to recognize racism as a key determinant of health outcomes. And there's just such a disconnect, because this city was ground zero for the George Floyd protests, obviously, and the so-called racial reckoning that has happened throughout this country, but it is absolutely incapable of recognizing the continued and historic harms that it causes to certain communities. So can you tell me about that sort of attitude from these city officials? You had Jacob Fry in his suit show up to MMIWR, Murdered Missing Indigenous Women and Relatives rally in the East Phillips neighborhood, and was confronted by Nicole Perez, who is an Ojibwe grandmother, and saying, "How dare you come here and try to take photo ops with our children?"
Why are you doing the demolition on the roof depot when people at Little Earth matter there? No, I'm not going to stop it. We are not going to. We do not want demo on our people at Little Earth matter. Why are you here for your show?
Today is MMIW.
You're here for your show, and you're gonna take pictures with us, but then you're gonna sit there and you're gonna pollute us. You're not welcome here. Our indigenous people do not care about your merit parade. Why don't you answer my question? invited here. Our people are going to be polluted. It's genocide. Mayor Frey.
Hey, another time, okay?
Our Little Earth people matter.
They do.
Our kids are going to die, Mayor Frey, and this is going to be on your hands. This is on your hands, Mayor Frey.
Let's talk about that, okay?
Our Indigenous people matter. Answer the question. At least answer the Frey. To no demolition on Little Earth. You sit and lie to our people's face and said that you would support us. Can you answer me right now, Mayor Frey? We have a lot of women that have died, but you're going to kill our people. Our people of Little Earth are going to die because of you. Answer our questions. Stop the demo. Our homeless people, your people have been doing this to our people for many years, Mayor Frey. This is genocide. You are killing our people. My daughter has asthma. No, because you're just going to ignore us, just like you're doing now. You have no answer for us, do you, Mayor Frey? Answer, because you're killing our people, Mayor Frey. Our people of Little Earth matter. Answer. Answer us. No compassion for our people. Little Earth matters, and no to the demo. No demo. No demo. No demo. No demo.
Get him out. Get him out.
No demo.
Get him out.
No demo. No demo.
When you vetoed a resolution for us to mitigate the harms that the city has caused for generations. And I just thought it was like, this is the definition of the relationship between the city and, you know, not just East Phillips, but Little Earth and the indigenous communities that have lived here for generations. Right. So can you talk about that political process? Like, you have very concrete goals that you're trying to implement, but what has been the city's response, and what is your plan going forward?
Yeah, I mean, when you really look at the history of it, it's been a bunch of back and forths. You know, back in 2018, City Council voted unanimously to demolish Roof Depot and to move forward with its Hiawatha expansion project, which is the truck depot for folks. And then in 2020 and 2021, it escalated again. And, you know, it was in that recognition of that racial reckoning that we were dealing with. George Floyd and George Floyd Square, 30th in Chicago, it's less than a mile away from the site. You know, the 3rd precinct is less than a mile from the site. When the city was burning, Little Earth residents, East Phillips residents could just look outside of their home and see the smoke. You know, we understood that. And at the time, you know, it's been a bunch of reversals, you know, from the city and really from Public Works, which has been spearheading this project, you know, since the 2000s, because an old city council member, the former 9th Ward city council member, promised Roof Depot to Public Works for its new facility. So we're being beholden to a promise that we never made. And it's, again, for folks out there, you know, when your city is undergoing zoning changes, pay close attention, because developers pay close attention and they come after communities and put mixed use developments that can sometimes be industry. Whole different topic though. But it's important to check that out because, you know, the urban planning for your community is going to dictate what it's going to look like in the future. But right now, you know, we see public enemy as Public Works and Fry, and their feeling towards the community has always been disdain. You know, we have community, you know, Rachel was talking about aunties and grandmothers, you know, community members themselves who have talked about air quality, nebulizers, health going down, knowing what they need to feel better, but then going to city and city council and being told, well, we know what's better for you. So this kind of paternal, which is nothing new for indigenous people. This has just been the mantra of the U.S. government since it's incoming. And, you know, last summer that, you know, Nick, you referenced, we won an 8-4 victory at City Hall And then the mayor vetoed because we were one vote short of a majority proof, veto proof, vote. And that's because the city really clamped down on city council members. We went in there with 9 votes, but they were able to peel away either through threats. As I said, I've been in this fight for 2.5 years, and I've heard from city council members that Public Works has just straight out threatened them. And I won't name names, but he said, it was during an election year, and Public Works pretty much went up to him and said, well, if you vote for this roof depot thing, we won't be able to get to your projects. And, an election year is important, and you have to prove and showcase, you are effective to your constituents. So to hold your residents' projects hostage, really just underscores how Public Works in itself is this type of shadow entity that really has a huge control over, the functions of our city. And we see that with how they clear out encampments. They have a huge influence on how those policies are shaped. Oftentimes people see representatives, and they are accountable for what transpires, but city staff are really like another 50% of like how horrible things are. And, you saw that in that clip you were referencing, at the most recent vote, where we had Little Earth residents pleading for the lives of their grandchildren to city council members. They wouldn't even look at her. Even before the meeting began, they were trying to meet and discuss this issue. And they said, well, you can schedule a meeting whenever. Take the survey, schedule a time and date after this. And it's, again, it really shows you where this is at. And it's hugely, what's the word, hurt? Just because, like, it's not surprising, but it just is further proof of why our people don't go into these spaces, because they're met like this, where they feel like they're unheard and that their opinions don't matter. And that's what shuns them away from politics.
I think I'll add a little bit on. Nick, you mentioned that the mayor was run out of the missing, murdered Indigenous women and relatives march and prayer just here on Valentine's Day in South Minneapolis. At the exact same time when he was on his way to that march, the city ordered the eviction and clearing of an unhoused encampment here on South Side. So you had the mayor showing up for his token photos at an already extremely heavy prayer and event for our missing, murdered Indigenous women. And at the same time, we're marching by a camp that is actively being cleared. In the 1 mile march, we marched past the camp that the city ordered to be cleared on that exact same day. And I don't know who first said this phrase, but I think about it a lot, because you drive around the city here, there's unhoused everywhere. Our people, Indigenous people, we were never homeless on Turtle Island before 1492, ever. And it's this system, the systemic racism, the system of oppression, this attack on our community, on our health, by not hearing us, is just a continuation of that cultural genocide that's been going on for over 530 years now. And, the city, I was recently a part of this discussion, this like 3-part discussion where they wanted to bring in different people from different communities and cultures to write a new definition of racism for this decree that the city is doing on declaring war on racism. And the discussions in that three-part series really just solidified for me in my mind the naiveness of some of the people who are making these decisions, and how their worldviews or their perceptions of their realities do not reflect our perceptions and our realities in some of our communities, right? So there's some people that are just ignorant by circumstance because they haven't lived the multi-generational trauma that our people have lived. But then you also have these people that are ignorant by choice and are actively making these decisions for power and control and money and advancement of capitalism in the society that we are existing in and a part of today. So with the Roof Depot, you know, with it being such a large property, you know, a little over 7 acres, you know, this issue of our unhoused it's not just the unhoused. You have to look at all of these different facets that are the outcomes of this multi-generational trauma and genocide that has been happening for hundreds of years, right? There's a lot of healing that needs to happen in our communities. You have addiction with drugs and alcohol. You have the MMIW and R, the missing, murdered Indigenous women and relatives. You know, our unhoused, connection to ceremony and land, community development, community gatherings, positive spaces for our youth, access to clean food and healthy food, all of these things. If we can't feed our people, then we're not ever going to be truly sovereign. And I feel like there's a lot of attacks on our sovereignty currently today. You know, look at the Indian Child Welfare Act that's under review by the United States Supreme Court. If we can't feed ourselves, we're not sovereign. If we can't keep our children, we're not sovereign. If the treaties aren't honored and reviewed, and even, you know, maybe new treaties need to be drawn in some situations. These are all attacks on our sovereignty that have continued. And the government and the cities and the states, they all like to make it this like big convoluted mess. But really, it's pretty basic and simple when you get down to the core values of it. And Roof Depot symbolizes all of these issues, right? Because we don't want this industrialization in our community. We want clean food. We want clean water. We want spaces for our unhoused to not be moved and evicted from camp to camp in the winter in freezing temperatures. We want a safe space for community and for children and our women and our elders to gather. We want community space where we can have ceremonies and events and create this positive environment so that we can begin to address all of these issues. And there's a lot more that I didn't mention. And that's what we're proposing. So if the city wants to create this quote unquote war on racism, then they need to do some deep introspection, or basically they're declaring war on themselves.
Yeah, I think you're pretty nice in saying that they were naive or even ignorant. I think there's a lot more intention here because they're just following the profit motive at the end of the day. Like, they profit from the death of indigenous people, period. Like, that's been the history of the state. It was founded by people who were architects of Dakota genocide, who are literally, you know, putting themselves into the treaties, such as Alexander Ramsey, you know, Sully. They're putting themselves into treaties and pocketing that money. And that mentality and that system hasn't changed. It's literally the same, like the same people in power. And it's not a bipartisan issue, because here you have liberals, ostensibly the people who are quote unquote allies, carrying out the very kind of same projects that, you know, somebody like Kristi Noem would carry out in South Dakota. but just smiling while they do it, or putting, you know, a baby on their, a native baby on their lap, or a red dress in their profile picture, you know. And even it goes to the heart of even the elites that have been created and you know, in our own communities, sadly, you know. And I think this is the power of this particular movement, and my limited engagement with the ethnic struggle is that it's very grassroots oriented. There's no denying that. You can't sit in front of anyone and say that this is, you know, and not listen to a, you know, a native grandmother, like, who's tearing up and crying about, like, hey, I don't want asthma anymore. Like, why is that? Why does she have to beg for her life? Why does she have to beg for the life of her children? You know, like, native lives just simply don't matter. Like, that's the end, you know, that's the conclusion that you can draw from all of this. And I, you know, I don't want to get on my soapbox here, but there are some concrete actions that both of you have, you know, proposed. What are those actions? And, you know, this is going to air probably as soon as we end this call. So if there's concrete things that people can do right now, if there's events that are happening, you know, we're running up on a short kind of deadline here. What are they, and how can people best support your guys' work?
Yeah, there is a multitude of ways to get involved. Just because we want to recognize different capacities, you know, allies from different states, different countries, that has been pretty consistent. I am sharing content. So, you know, we have a Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Look up East Phillips Urban Farm, East Phillips Neighborhood Institute. That's our Facebook. The others would be, you know, Instagram and Twitter. Share our content. You know, email city council members is another thing. Let them know this issue is not, you know, gone. It's still at the forefront. You know, we do have an event on the 19th, a solidarity rally with our relatives in Atlanta, No Cop City, Defend the Forest, Defend East Phillips. That'll be at 26 and Longfellow, which is at the edge of Roof Depot. We will be gathering there, hearing speeches from the activists from Atlanta, as well as activists and land defenders here at East Phillips. And, you know, Nick, you touched on it. This has all been grassroots. So donate to the campaign. We have a GoFundMe. And I would also just put out there, you know, we've talked about Little Earth so much, you know, donate to them. You know, they could use the funds to continue these amazing cultural classes that Rachel, you know, discussed, as well as, you know, the youth programming that they have there. You know, we always want to show solidarity, you know, to, you know, our comrades and our relatives. Rachel, can you think of anything else?
I'll just echo a lot of what you said, Joe. I think that the social media awareness is really powerful. That's a tool that our ancestors didn't have in the past, and especially, you know, during the civil rights movement. That's something that we really need to utilize today to get word out there about, you know, these grassroots actions that are happening, like Roof Depot. We are having the event on the 19th, and I believe that's at 1 p.m., correct? Okay, at 1 p.m., just outside of Roof Depot, and we encourage as many to come as possible. We are also currently building a Facebook page specifically on actions surrounding the Roof Depot. And in the works right now, we're planning a convoy on the 22nd to all meet up at Little Earth and have a convoy that drives to the city council here in Minneapolis. So just, you know, call city council members, state reps, state senators here in Minnesota to advocate for the health and the protection and honoring our rights as Indigenous people here in Minneapolis on stolen land.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, we talked about like the cities and the staff's animosity towards, you know, the community, which is incredibly true. But Rachel, with you know, your own experience at the state, when you talk about this issue anywhere else, everybody's like, yeah, how can we help? You know, we've talked with the county who wants to throw money at, you know, our affordable housing plans with the project. The state wants to give us money, but we're gridlocked with the city because the city owns the land. It's all predicated on who has the deed, because we can't acquire funds or funding, to develop or to start this programming because we simply just don't have control over the land. Multiple times we've gotten millions of dollars of investment to start working on this project, only to be told we cannot because the city simply just has the power. And so want to reach out to folks. The community is not done fighting. There is always a possibility of victory. We just got to keep on the pressure on the city because we have so many actors outside of the city that want to make the community vision possible.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. And, again, we'll put these links in the show description, the GoFundMe, the social media links, as well as the dates of the action. So thanks so much, Rachel and Joe, for joining me. I'll see you all on Sunday and then also on the 22nd to raise a little hell and raise a little bit of hearts and minds.
Heck yeah.
So thanks so much.
Giga Wobbleman.
Yeah. Thank you.